Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Charlotte Burns. Thank you to you all for joining us on a Sunday. Before I introduce today's panel, I want to mention that we would love to receive your questions, which we will endeavour to answer either during the talk or at the end. So feel free to use the Q&A function, which is a button you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We'll respond to as many as we can. We also have live captioning available. You should see the CC icon also at the bottom of your screen, and so you can read the subtitles if you'd like. So today's discussion, Thinking Globally, Selling Locally, the rise and potential fall again of regional art markets, is the third and final talk of Art Basel's OVR Miami Beach Conversations program. Thank you for joining us to my panelists, Liza Essers, Pedro Mendes, and Suzanne Deal Booth. Liza is the owner and director of Goodman Gallery, which has spaces in Johannesburg and Cape Town and recently opened in London's Mayfair too. Liza is behind a new initiative called South South, which we'll be hearing a lot more about during this talk, so I'll leave her to explain that. Liza was the owner and director since 2008 of that gallery. Pedro founded in 2010 the gallery Mendes Wood DM in Sao Paulo with his partners Felipe de Mab and Matthew Wood. And in 2017, the gallery opened an exhibition space in New York and its European space in Brussels the same year. And also we have joining us today, Suzanne Deal Booth, who is an art advocate, philanthropist, and vintner. Through her patronage, Sky Space by James Turrell, Twilight Epiphany was realized in 2012 among her many accomplishments, which also include a Biennale Prize for Artists, and in 2020, the $200,000 Suzanne Deal Booth Flag Art Foundation Prize, a newly merged edition of the previous prize that Suzanne had founded, which is a major exhibition and scholarly publication prize, and was most recently awarded to Nicole Eisenman. Suzanne is on the board of various museums, including LACMA, the Menil Collection, and the Calder Foundation. Thank you guys all for being here, especially on a Sunday in December. So I wanted to start by asking you, regionalism used to be a dirty word. If you called a gallery or an artist regional, for a long time it was akin to saying that they were somehow provincial. Whereas the truth is that some of the greatest art movements have been regional, whether that's the Renaissance artists working together or in a close circle in Italy, or the Hairy Who in Chicago. Do you think regionalism is still a dirty word? And that's to any of you, all of you.
I'm happy to go. No, I'm from a great regional place. I'm from Texas, which covers a lot of territory. But I also consider the American Southwest, which has an abundance of art and artists and creativity and galleries and museums. So I've never felt that being regional or representing a place or being interested in it was anything but kind of just looking at the same level of artist intent as you would anywhere else. So I do not think it's a dirty word. I think it's great.
I remember saying last year, actually, to an art director of a major American museum, as a compliment, you know, the museum was grounded in the regional, it always had local supporters, and he took extraordinary offense at that. Liza, do you think it's a dirty word? Was it? Is it still?
So I think for our context, I think that it's more complicated and more layered. For the longest time, you know, living in an apartheid South Africa, it was important to have sideline voices come to the center to know what was happening. I don't think it needs to be, I sort of refuse to have the binary distinction really. I think both have an importance. I think it's been really incredible to be able to have the time to be in Johannesburg, not jumping on an airplane every 5 minutes to get to the center and really concentrate on helping to build a local audience and spend time in local artist studios, which I ordinarily just would not have had the time to do. But I do feel that it's really equally important to really keep remaining, you know, there shouldn't be these regions, you know, we need to be seen as one global art world. And that too is very important politically for many reasons.
Pedro?
Charlotte, hi. It's fascinating to think that if you think the word regional in 1940s, one could say that New York was a regional art town. It's only in the post-war that the avant-garde moves from Paris to New York and the scene starts to build up. I feel that any art movement originates and in its inception is local, it is regional. It is the hermeneutics and the transformation of that local meaning that becomes global. But it seems that the meaning making is always related to a community or to a local question.
Context.
Right. So the idea with this talk, in essence, is that because of COVID, we're all starting to think more locally. Do you think that that's true, and therefore there may be some growth locally, or do you think that the equivalent might be like retail, during which actually the local high street is, you know, the death of it has been accelerated while the big brand Amazon has made a killing in terms of record profits? Do you see that there will be benefits locally, or do you think this will just accelerate trends towards the bigger brands?
Well, I see, I'm predominantly in Texas, but I do see that there are more exhibitions in galleries and museums that are being planned for local artists. And I think that's wonderful. They haven't always had that platform. You know, Deborah Roberts, I'll give an example, is a local Austin artist who's now being shown in major museums, but she's never had a show in Texas. Finally, we're going to have it. So I see good out of it.
Well, that brings me on to this question about museums. I was talking to a curator in one of the big New York institutions recently who said, you know, we're a New York museum right now, and we have to think that way. We have to think about, we can't rely on the tourists. And so the entire model of who we make a museum show for has shifted. And that comes down to really, you know, prosaic questions like, what languages do you write the wall text in? Who do you orientate the marketing materials towards? Who do you orientate the exhibition displays towards most significantly? Do you see that shifting, Liza and Pedro, in your areas too? Are museums thinking more locally, or do you think, and when I say that, I'm referring to the different gallery spaces you have. I'm sure you can see differences wherever your gallery bases are established.
I think we certainly are kind of looking at language within the Johannesburg Gallery, and having, you know, Zulu as a language that is reflected in some of the exhibitions in terms of the texts. So yes, definitely.
And with your local museums, do you see that? Do you see that the museums are becoming more local during this time, less local in terms of supporting?
Sadly, Charlotte, we don't have a significant museum base in, you know, certainly not in Johannesburg. More recently in Cape Town, a few institutions have opened up, like Zaat's Mocha and the Norval Foundation, and in fact Joburg Contemporary Art Foundation, but there's very little activity. They're all private rather than big public institutions that, you know, that there's no funding from government for our public institutions. So there's very little energy, unfortunately.
Yeah, interesting, because I have seen also a shift towards the local research. I mean, this year is a year of São Paulo Biennial, and the São Paulo Biennial, which has opened and will be presented in chapters, which is quite of a challenge in a year of pandemic, has drawn a very interesting audience that is mostly local, but it's also, it has targeted the communities that are that normally have not been able to attend. The fact that the biennial has many broadcasts that are done online, and that museums also have platforms online in a positive way, has allowed a larger audience to attend. So obviously, the experience, as we all know, is a very different one. But right. I have a feeling that institutions have been obliged to rethink the ways that they interact with the public, and the way that they present their public program, and the way they present their educational program, and the way that they generate, that they transmute that symbolic value into an audience that normally wasn't really specialized in the theme.
Right.
So what I have seen in museums as well, such as MASP, is the turning towards a program that is more based upon the collection of the museum, the interaction of local artists around the collection of the museum, and how new dialogues can come about
through that.
from the existing material.
So I want to ask you all now a question, which is this presumption that we're going to become more local now. Do you think we were really global before, or was it a myth? In a book called Cosmopolitan Canvases, the economist Olav Veltus found that major market events such as art fairs were hardly affected by globalization. For example, 2/3 of the galleries in Art Basel in 2014 had headquarters in 4 countries alone, the US, Germany, the UK, and Switzerland. And those numbers are fairly consistent through time. And as a market reporter covering these events for years, we would find it to be the case, running around asking galleries, how's it going? What have you sold? Who have you sold to? Who have you seen? That pretty much the responses tended to fall along geographical lines. The Brazilian galleries would have seen the Brazilian collectors first. The Parisian galleries would have seen the Parisian collectors first, and so on and so forth. So to what extent do you think that we were truly global, or were we just kind of global regional, that it was a huge marketplace where the main sort of model of the art market, the kind of Western countries were still the majority rule with elements of global thrown in? Do you think we were global, or was it a myth?
Look, there was a survey that was done between 2004 and 2014 by a constellation of art market researchers that discovered that the entry of countries and the entry of new coming buyers has increased 564%. That Christie's reported that in 2012, there were 128 bidders in their platforms. Mm-hmm. And last year, that number has increased, and it has vastly enlarged by the fact that now you have platforms that allow online bidding, that allows for telephone bidding. In a way, the trading has shrunk. I have a feeling that the world has shrunk and the trading has expanded immensely through very different countries. What has happened this year is that I think the attention towards art production has gone more locally, and perhaps I think that's what the pandemic has brought is a more curatorial eye to local art making.
I think that's really interesting, because if you think about it, the role of curators and collectors in facilitating global expansion, Suzanne, you can speak to this. The curators and the collectors are to some extent that kind of glue. They're the people who do so much traveling. They create those physical connections between different places through that travel. And to some extent, the markets and the growth of markets or places as artistic hubs has been facilitated or determined by the extent to which curators and collectors can gain access to those places. So we've seen the growth of certain centers because people can get into those centers, they can communicate, they can get around. Do you think that, what role do you think that, Suzanne, starting with you, that collectors and curators can serve and can play, especially in this moment when things have become more local? And, for galleries, the ability to go to one event and reach out and meet you, for example, if they were from Brussels, then how can that be replicated now? How are you looking at art during this period?
Well, I do think these are challenging times. I'm sure for gallerists, and as a collector and someone who just loves to look at art, it hasn't slowed me down. If anything, I'm online even more looking at things, and I think the same thing happened at an art fair. I would wander around and sometimes just be delighted by something new I had never seen before in a gallery I'd never heard of. So that's sort of what's missing now, is that opportunity to explore new spaces. I tend to be reactive to what comes to me, but these platforms of having art fairs, of course, are giving a lot of people the opportunity to prowl around in a different way. I just think it's more challenging.
And for Liza and for Pedro, to some extent, do you think, I'm going to get back to this idea of curators and collectors in a moment, but these online experiences, is it more fulfilling for you from the demand side or the supply side? By which I mean, I'm sure this is a helpful mechanism, the online viewing rooms, to ask your artists to give you more work. Whereas if you look at the old model, before we had these big market events, you had a roster, a relatively small roster of artists in one place. You were based in your city and you had, 20, maybe 30 artists, and they would wait for their show in your one space. That used to be the model. Now people have more outposts. You have three apiece, and you have a large roster of artists. And then you also require work for the art fair events, also the biennials, and also the expansion of museums through that kind of global thing. So do you find that this is a helpful way of keeping the supply side up to have these online viewing rooms, or is it still as rewarding from the demand side too?
I mean, just to come back to one of your previous comments, Charlotte, because we've been talking about a few different things. I think for myself, just talking about the art fairs, they really have been hugely important and central to the Goodman Gallery for many, many years. And we've been incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be at the art fairs. It really is where we have had the opportunity of meeting all collectors and curators. And so did not share the experience of, for example, just having South African collectors come to our booth, but was hugely rewarding, to meet the incredible, global group of collectors from all over the world and curators. And yes, I guess I miss that terribly. It feels very isolating being in Johannesburg at this time, even in a week like Miami Basel. This is wonderful just to be on this call with all of you and just kind of share a sense of community and collaboration and, see everybody, see Pedro and, meet Suzanne. So, yeah, I just wanted to kind of just come in there, that it's a very different experience for me, to what you reflected on.
I think as well, Ed, the great Ed Winkleman, who's organized these talks, in a pre-chat that he and I had, said that the impetus for this talk was this idea that people had said, in this moment, we're all going to become much more local. And he was thinking, as someone who's run a gallery, written a book about how to do so, that actually it was a dangerous thing to think that it was a good thing for emerging galleries during this moment in which the gallery model is under such pressure anyway, and it was before the pandemic for various reasons, that it was slightly dangerous to say that people should go back to a super local model anyway, because the point of the fairs was that you shopped for collectors, that you could go back and you could have a Rolodex full of collectors who you would never otherwise have met, to your point, Liza. And not only is it the point that they were a broad base of people that you wouldn't have met, they were already people primed to make sales and support your program. You didn't have to convert them. If they were walking through the doors of the convention center on the opening day, then they probably bought art, they probably were serious about it, and they probably would be able to have a conversation with you that wouldn't require the same degree of education and handholding as converting local collectors and building up a scene that's nascent. And so, Ed's point was that this idea of converting people locally and focusing totally on local artists could be a little perilous for emerging galleries, because it has been the case for a period of time that being international is what's been rewarded. It's sort of like the gateway artist. If you have an internationally recognized artist, then people might come to your booth, and then that's the gateway artist to introduce them to other artists in your program. And in fact, for some fairs, having international artists has been a requirement of getting into a fair. And so, there are potential pitfalls to going back to the kind of older model before, in the 1990s, where things were hyper-local in that way, that you built your local scene and that was kind of it. Does that concern you about this moment, all of you? That's a question to all of you, beginning wherever we like.
I have a feeling, Charlotte, that there's been obviously the need to expand our audiences through art fairs. It has been enormously beneficial to Mendes Wood, and I'm sure, as Liza says, to her gallery, to Goodman Gallery, to be able to reach out a larger audience. However, I have a feeling that art fairs and the art system has been enormously eliticizing, in the sense that it became very expensive for emerging galleries to travel. And it has become very prohibitive for emerging curators and emerging collectors and a young public to buy art. So there's been, in a way, an inflation of costs, but also an inflation of prices. that has become very pernicious to the sustainability of the system. So when you look in a more ample perspective, what you see is that going back to a local audience is an exercise of of allowing art and the system to go back to a different tempo, a tempo that is longer fruition, smaller shows, less expensive venues. Rem Koolhaas curiously opened a show at the Guggenheim in February, just as the lockdown in New York took place in March, which was about going back to the countryside. And that was the theme of the show. The very author who wrote Delirious New York opened his new thesis at the Guggenheim, which was time to go back to the countryside, time to go back to the local, time to produce locally, time to re-inhabit our roots. And I thought that was really relevant as an epigraph, as a preceding the calamity that we lived this year, to have someone who is a philosopher and an architect thinking that the future of the world is not to go beyond its borders, it is to produce locally, to think locally, to generate systems of fruition and entertainment that are local. So I think it is all possible, and I think possibly complementary. But I think this was quite of an important movement to be aware, because the local crises have been very much predicated on the excesses of global trading and the excesses of global purchasing.
I remember somebody saying to me a couple of years ago, I've never made so much money and I've never worked so hard and spent so much either. And, you know, they were wondering a couple of years ago, is this sustainable anyway? Like on paper, they're wealthier, but actually they're spending so much just to keep up that it didn't seem that sustainable. Suzanne, do you think it was sustainable from your point of view as a collector? Did you feel that there was too much to keep up with?
No, I never felt that way. But I mean, I think we all have our own appetites for how much we can take.
Right.
That's one of the things I've missed it during this time period is the one-on-one with art. I'm looking at a lot on the computer, but I haven't seen a lot of exhibitions.
Yeah.
I'm in London, opened up here. It was so exciting to kind of go out and see an exhibition. It was new and, you know, a novelty.
Yeah. Although I do remember one of the first shows I saw after the lockdown lifted was not a great show. And I thought, oh, I didn't miss seeing mediocre art either. You know? Liza, do you think it was sustainable? I know for you, you've spoken about the makeup of your client base. How much are you happy to talk about that publicly, the extent to which you have a local marketplace and an international marketplace?
Sure,
Charlotte.
Yeah, I guess our turnover is really 80% international and 20% local. So we certainly are very reliant, or have been very reliant, on the art fairs. But of course, opening the gallery in London has shifted things significantly in terms of just having more of a presence, you know, globally, and it's been hugely important. And I think also just with so grateful that even though it was just before lockdown, and very grateful to have had that space opened. And then, of course, I think taking art, I've felt the need to really, you know, open pop-ups. So we're opening a pop-up in Miami, in the design district next week, and we've got one in New York at the moment, and then more locally in Plettenberg Bay, which is kind of, I guess, the East Hampton of of New York. So we've kind of taken the approach of not just sort of, you know, yes, very much sitting at home, focusing on building a local audience, running 5-day art history courses, really taking the time right now to build collectors in South Africa.
The education process.
And the education process, but by the same token, very focused on, you know, getting art to, to our collectors.
And so
in alternative ways.
It's a sort of super concentrated local that you're, thinking of, you know, that audience in the sort of equivalent of the Hamptons, the Manhattan audience, the London audience, and trying to serve all of these different audiences. Pedro, you know, Liza, you've just said you were glad that you opened this space in London just before, because it's given you access to a local audience that you wouldn't otherwise have had that in real life connection with. Pedro, your gallery's expanded too. You have 3 outposts, or you had 3, you'd opened in 3 different countries. Are you glad that you were so international? Will you maintain that presence? Do you have any regrets about it?
It was immensely important, Charlotte, for us to have expanded to Belgium and to New York. For us, this year has been quite of a fascinating way to experience doing shows locally. We did a small exhibition in Retranchement, which is an outpost in the sea between Belgium and Holland, in a medieval church, and that gave immense pleasure to our artists to participate in a completely out of the box space. Also, we did a show in New Canaan, Connecticut, in the Eliot Noyes house, and we did a show at Villa Era in the Piemonte region. I think at the current moment where our artists are at and where our collecting base is, it's very much about giving our artists different experiences and allowing to produce in different contexts. So I think it's a constellation of factors. Having expanded was important, but also having expanded the reach of our collectors base, but also the curatorial bases and the possibilities of bringing those practices to a different realm.
I think that's a really important point, is this idea of artists. When as an art market editor, when this kind of expansion started happening of the galleries, where people started having more and more and more physical outposts in different countries, it was obviously seen as a way of staying in connection with the art, with the collectors and the curators in a certain place. But it's also about that need to keep hold of your artists. And you need to be able to provide your artists with exhibition possibilities, with new exhibition possibilities, with something different. How are you all dealing with maintaining those relationships with artists now? And Suzanne, you have significant relationships in terms of patronage. How are you maintaining that now? Because obviously there's been lockdown, people haven't been able to travel. How do you keep that going? I mean, obviously you can stage pop-up exhibitions and do things here and there, but in terms of, that's only a couple of iterations of things. That's not necessarily every single artist in your program or every single artist that you really support. So how are you keeping all of that going when there are clearly fewer exhibition options for them?
Well, it's really through the galleries and the curators. Like, for instance, you had spoken earlier about the small market and the global market. Like you would go to an art fair, you would go to the galleries you knew the best, probably from your own city, if you're Parisian or New Yorker or whatever. And I think that's true. You keep in touch with those. Those are connections and relationships, and you keep in touch with those people. And especially if you are also interested in a particular artist. And I think in this context, during this period, so many artists have had the opportunity to just work more and go in new directions. I think it's an interesting time. It will prove to be an interesting time in terms of the creativity of these artists.
Interesting. Liza, what do you think?
I definitely agree with Suzanne. I mean, the most incredible work is coming out of artist studios. Really, just I think artists not having to get on a plane, regularly have been able to really focus and spend time in their studios. And I think we think we're going to be very privileged with the quality of work that is coming out of the studios.
Pedro, your thoughts?
I absolutely agree with both Suzanne and Lisa. There's been a real jump into the abyss of the unknown, and it has been really challenging to keep the mental sanity of all of us, the artists, the collectors. And I think this being an interlocutor of so many people has been a very interesting thing, to be able to understand that moments of crisis do generate greater sensibility and greater creativity. And as much as it's been, I think for many artists, quite challenging to be locked inside their studios, it has also been a great moment to experience different paths and different possibilities to create. So
One thing I wanted to ask you, picking up from that, is, we're talking about production here, and let's keep talking about that in tandem with the market, in the sense that Veltus in his book wrote about this idea that when we talk about the global nature of the art world and of the art market, what we could also say that we mean specifically is the architecture of the art market, which had its roots in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that's a thing that's been exported globally, this idea that galleries support artists locally. They build up a network of patrons who are willing to buy into that vision and support that work. And then that's changed with the advent of biennales, which, Sao Paulo is a very old, long-standing biennale, Venice too, but with the increasing proliferation of them, with the proliferation of art fairs and this idea of things becoming more international physically with the different outposts, that model has been under threat anyway before the pandemic, because as you were saying, Pedro, the sustainability of it, the cost of it, the sheer exhaustion that people were talking about, and this sense of ennui, the sense that, there was a kind of art fair art, you knew what you would see, you knew what the galleries would bring, that things had gone from being an experiment to an efficient system, and the efficiency was perhaps predictable and unexciting. Do you think now that there are different models emerging? Are you considering different models yourself? Are you discussing that with colleagues? And that can be as broad as, I'm much more interested in collaborating, or it could be as specific as, yes, I am going to do X, Y, and Z to my program, and this is how I'm thinking about physicality and fairs. So I start with the gallerists first and then go to you, Suzanne. So Liza, what are you thinking?
Certainly, I think that going forward, one would have to be a lot more selective of the art fairs that one does, because there's no question that it was just becoming way too much. And so I think becoming a lot more selective around art fairs is going to be critical. Yeah. I have been thinking about alternative models, and something that really sort of struck me during lockdown was, I don't know how long, this could be another year that, perhaps we won't be able to travel from South Africa. But I've been thinking a lot more around the fact that I think that collaboration is absolutely everything. And very, very important, I think, philosophically as well. And so during lockdown, as an extension of a curatorial initiative, which I started 12 years ago when I took over the Goodman Gallery, was a curatorial initiative called South-South, and have decided to, and there's been many iterations of the South-South project, which at its core was about collaboration with numerous colleagues from around the world looking at the Global South. We've moved this into a platform which will premiere or sort of launch the end of January, beginning of February, and we have 45 galleries that have signed up onto the platform, and the primary focus of the South-South platform will be around content and collaboration. Also with a physical manifestation that happens in multiple cities around the world. The first edition will have a physical manifestation in Mexico City, New York, London, Tokyo, and Johannesburg. So I think collaboration is absolutely key. And I think that as gallerists and as artists and curators in an art world, I think that that is, for me, what I think I would like to see sort of moving forward, rather than kind of, this kind of everybody fighting for each other's artists. I think something that is much more collaborative and much more coexisting in its nature, I think would be beautiful to see.
Pedro, do you think that's possible? Do you think the art gallery is going to get along after this? The art market's going to be less ruthless?
Look, obviously there's a certain hostility among the big galleries that we can see, artists being poached from one to the other and so on. And there's this major appetite for inventory, which was partially fueled, I feel, for the large expenses that the system represents, fairs, biennials, etc. The circus is ongoing. Now, I have a feeling that collaboration is not only the key, but it is the only way for the system to survive. It is a system that of exchange of ideas to begin, and is a system where meaning is being built upon the discussions that are presented in a global scale. Look at what happens when a single event like the assassination of George Floyd has this immense impact in every single city in the world. It is almost like a new 1968, where people are actually going to the streets and saying, this is enough. The new canon has to change. We have to think not only of the cultural legacy of the African diaspora, but we also have to reinvent ourselves, and we have to challenge the system that is male-centric, white male-centric, and when that happens, we realize that there's something major to be done in what we do. We are resistance, we are activists in a way. Art is political after all. So if we're thinking simply and purely in market terms, we're simply thinking in terms of commerce and in terms of commodification of ideas, which is not the reason we exist. It is just a consequence that came about in order to allow for artists to live and the agents to live, but not primary cause. So I think the inversion can be fixed through collaboration.
Suzanne?
I strongly believe in that.
How do you feel about collaboration? Do you see more of it happening? Would you desire more of it?
Well, I think it's essential. I'm hoping that from this period that we, not just people in the art world, but everyone, that we become more insightful, more aware, more connected, perhaps, to all these different things going on around us, and that in a way will unite us. I'm hoping for this outcome. We don't know yet because we're still in the middle of it, but I've certainly seen indications that people are more open to discussion about different ways of doing things. And that's with the arts organizations I'm working with, in talking to artists, and in universities as well. They are looking for creative ways to implement their vision, which in many cases is reaching out to students or other people in the world with a meaningful message. So I just more of that.
So one thing I wanted to ask you both, Liza, you were just saying it might be another year for you till you can move more freely. And this is to do with the distribution of the vaccine, when and if it comes. And it reminds me of the very beginning of this pandemic. People, the greatest lie of the initial reaction was we're all in this together, which of course is absolutely untrue and is closely related to the protests and the, world outrage after the murder of George Floyd. That people are not in this together. People are dying unequally, and certain people are suffering much, much more than other people, largely dependent on their wealth, their access to healthcare, education, their race, their geographic location. And so coming out of this, that's only going to be more the case, that certain countries will have belated access to vaccines than others, that certain local centers will, revive and snap back, as we're already seeing. There are certain centers in the US that are essentially, the snowbirds have become the art world center in many ways of America. Do you see that, well, I guess the other way of saying that is this idea of global and local is largely informed by the framework of the colonial, and that both exist because they survived colonialism. And so coming through this, do you see that we will be in a situation where we can pick the best of the global and the local, or will we be in a situation that more closely mirrors the legacy of power as it was spread and distributed through colonialization?
I see it as more of the same, just kind of, living in the uneven society that we do live in.
Right.
So, sadly.
Pedro, do you see the same? You see different?
Look, I feel that there is a push-pull between what is local and what is global. I think that the debate is being stirred up by the fact that climate change is an issue, and more than ever, we need to think about how to create a system of distribution of ideas, of goods, of cultural assets that is less reliant on global traveling. So I do feel that in a way, the digitalization of the art system has been a very positive thing, in the sense that it allows for not only a larger audience to reach. I'm obviously an idealist, but I'm also a realist, in the sense that I know that not every single artist or every single young student will have access to internet, but I think the chances of partaking into a global discussion have become much larger now than it
Right.
was, say, 2 years ago. I think any art student could be on any art platform, if they have access to a computer or anything that allows them to connect. So I do feel that the system will be revised in that sense. That the experience of art will be transformed by that. The production of art will be transformed by this advent of this new channels of
Distribution.
of distributing and displaying and commercing
And
creating.
communicating, yeah, exactly. Suzanne, what do you think?
Oh, I agree with my colleagues here that it's all just happening, and we just are going to be participants in this, and hopefully visionaries in
Right.
new ways that people can collaborate. Definitely.
So the system will be the system unless people change the system, as was ever thus. So we're almost getting to the stage, I think, where we can start opening this up for questions. So if you are listening in, then please start typing away in the Q&A function, and we'll look at that in a minute. But before we do, I wanted to ask you three, thinking locally, thinking globally. Pedro, I remember visiting your gallery in Brazil years ago, and I was struck by how different the experience was immediately upon walking in. It felt more like walking into, it was this kind of relaxation that you get when you walk into a cafe that it's extremely upscale, but with very good coffee, a relaxed vibe, and great art. Whereas in Chelsea, which was my local gallery scene at the time, it was a very austere, different sort of experience. How do you keep the best of the local whilst thinking globally? And what is it that you would keep from this time? And what is it that you miss from the before times? And we'll start with Pedro here, and we'll go round.
So look, what I really truly miss, Charlotte, and thanks for appreciating the southern experience of a gallery. It is quite of a challenge to keep the public coming, and the public being able to feel at home in an art gallery. So we have devised a system that invites and welcomes the greater amount of people that we can. Now, what has been quite of a challenge this time is being precisely not being able to accept the grand public, the every visitor, and having scheduled hours and having appointment only and so on. That has been really frustrating. I've always seen the gallery as a forum of discussion. I've always seen the gallery as sort of the Athenian square, the Athenian square, where thinkers and artists and poets and rhapsodists come to recite and to discuss and listen and hear and fight and discuss. So that has been obviously being compromised by the appointment only system. So I do really miss, if there's one thing, is being able to welcome everyone who walks in.
Yeah. Liza?
Very much similar to Pedro. I think more so the Goodman Gallery in Johannesburg has functioned for many years as an institute for contemporary art in the absence of museums. So we would often have 2,000 people in the parking lot, large performances, very much a public space. And so that's been very sad, needing to, not make that space available to the broader public and to broader audiences. We have tried. So luckily, there's a lot of space in the Johannesburg Gallery, a huge garden, and so we've actually kind of mainly spent money in the last couple of months in really creating a gorgeous garden. which really, it's massive, so that there would be a lot more outdoor space, and coffee stands outside in the garden and juice bars. So trying to create a much more outdoor open space in the gardens, that we can kind of create much more of that, more of an interactive feeling, rather than just the bookings by appointment. But it is, of course, very, very limited still. And
yeah,
will continue to be, no doubt.
Suzanne, for you?
Well, just following up on what Liza said, outdoor spaces. I think there's more happening with public parks, gardens, any kind of park that's installed outside, to be able to allow people to, move around and have that opportunity. In Texas, there's also been a lot of outdoor, I don't know, they project a movie and you can watch it, but it's usually done at a museum or cultural center.
Right.
Anyway.
So, well, thank you all from me for answering all of my questions. I think we're going to go to the audience now. So let me just have a quick look. Here are a couple. So have the panelists seen patterns of seeking new artists change due to lockdown? How do you find artists? How do you discover artists during this time? I think is essentially what that question is asking. Are you seeing new artists? How is it that you can connect with work that you didn't know?
I'm thinking about it. I think it's along the lines of had people contacting you and say, take a look at this.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit of word of mouth, or a gallerist thinking about who would be interested in knowing about this new work. Because I think no other, it's either online or through relationships at this point that you had before.
Liza, for you, how do you see?
I've had some amazing studio visits on Zoom. I mean, it's not as rewarding. There's no question about it. And I'm really missing being in artist studios. I think that's one of my greatest pleasures. But I have visited more studios locally, in Johannesburg, which has also, has been amazing. But for the most part, internationally, it's been on Zoom, and it is very much, I think I agree with Suzanne, via relationships. So it would be a colleague suggesting, a particular artist. We do have a curatorial team at Goodman Gallery. There's kind of, 8 people in the curatorial team. So we will have ongoing conversations among us as to, artists that we think would be interesting to bring into the program. And it's very much a collaborative approach, and that's kind of how we look at finding new artists.
But it's a little harder. Pedro, are you finding it harder too?
It is. There's one side that is actually really rewarding, because there's not the taboo of asking a studio visit via Zoom, which can save you like long travels, and
especially in the traffic in Sao Paulo, no?
Especially being, in really like so far away from everywhere else in the world. So you can do a studio visit with a Chinese artist or a Korean artist without leaving your house. So that's, in a way, has been quite fascinating. We started working with an artist from Czech Republic, Wojtek, and during the pandemic, I knew the work, I was following the work, but all of a sudden I could do a studio visit.
That's really interesting, because it sort of makes before, the bigger galleries, they could fly in and use their private jet and sort of woo an artist in that way. So it makes the smaller galleries more competitive. Nobody can zoom in that same way.
I'm very hopeful, actually, that this new possibilities allow for a democratization of the system. Not only galleries can receive portfolios via Instagram or Zoom visits, but also you can visit the school students that are leaving their graduate programs, and you can see them without leaving. So there's something hopeful to look forward.
That's good. It's nice to have hope. And so another question here: what form do you see collaboration taking? I'm hearing a lot of discussion, but little actual practical, functional. And then continues down here. So essentially, how are you applying this? So the idea of collaboration is great, but but how can people actually practically do things that are in a more collaborative way? I mean, Liza, you can talk a bit about the, you know, the collaborations that you're doing are important, both your pop-ups and your Global South collaboration. Beyond that, you know, how do you collaborate more? How do you make it a less ruthless environment?
Well, I mean, for me, it's been around collaborating with colleagues in other art centres. I mean, for London, you know, during Freeze Week, colleagues all came together, you know, in Cork Street and did pop-ups and kind of all worked together to kind of, you know, locally within, you know, similarly for the Johannesburg Art Fair, you know, many galleries came together, created a gallery weekend and shared, the gallery weekend out to all of their databases, that there would be cross-pollination. We're sharing a space with Marion Boeski in Miami, and Adler Beatty generously offered us their space in New York, which was really very generous of them for our pop-up. I think the South-South, and I think the South-South platform, you know, has been about co-collaborators. Very much it's been, you know, talking every week with Jose from Kurimanzoto, with a wonderful gallerist from Uganda, Shireen from Press Called Shemalt in India, Nina in Japan. We've had Marcio from Rio, from Gentil, and Mary from Lelong. And that's been very rewarding, just talking to sort of 7 colleagues every week, sharing ideas, and you know, about broader things, and then, you know, in terms of developing this platform for the Global South, which we think is critical, especially for artists and galleries who, you know, who are definitely sidelined at a time of the pandemic, and
so
much more
strengthen numbers there.
Coming together and I think creating this aggregator, creating an aggregator site really for artists and curators and collectors and gallerists,
right,
which will continue beyond, you know, hopefully the pandemic, with a central resource center about all the important exhibitions that have happened in the Global South and texts. And, you know, hopefully this will be a collaboration that will, you know, we hope will continue, you know, way beyond as an important kind of moment around collaboration.
Pedro, do you see practical applications of collaboration? Are they the similar sort of thing to Liza, or are you seeing other things, or do you have other plans?
Well, we had our focus in doing a vast fundraising for this sort of the victims of this failing economy. So we created a group called Horizons, Horizontes, the original name, and we put together all the galleries towards debating possibility of a platform that would apply funds for artists, for curators, but also for those who are in deep needs in this moment of ginormous unemployment. Now, on another level, we have fostered collaborations with several galleries during the pandemic. We did shows together with Roman Poe. We have currently a show with Stuart Trade Modern of Laurie Cole, this quite interesting artist from who lived in Brazil and between Brazil and London. And we have really been true believers of this collaborative platforms, which has been really efficient. Now, also for not only for selling, but also for the visibility of artists.
I wanted to ask Suzanne a question now that's here specifically. It says, the question begins, how have galleries facilitated relationships between new collectors and artists? But I think the really interesting part of this question is for Suzanne, where he says, Suzanne, do you have any expectations as a collector, for how gallerists might better present new artists or bodies of art to you during this time? What's working for you as a way of viewing art and being sent art? What's standing out?
That's a good question. And I think it has to do with, I mean, like someone new approaching me. if they if they say to me, I think you would like this piece because of, first of all, I'm attracted by ideas. And so if there's a kind of a moment when you're actually sharing a conversation with someone, then you're probably sharing some ideas. So I think that is what is the hook for me. And I don't want to, that doesn't mean I want to be contacted by everyone. I'm a little bit inundated, but when someone takes the time to know about me and what they think I would like, then I find that interesting.
So the personal touch, essentially, take the time to make that effort. So, sorry, carry on.
No,
I'm sure you have a lot of, I'm sure your inbox is very full. I'm sure a lot of, there's an interesting question here about generational impact. Do you think that these changes will impact artists and collectors and gallerists of different generations? And so in your conversations, all of you, do you see that this is playing out differently in the way it's impacting different generations?
Look, I see, for instance, several galleries proposing going back to the possibility of a model that doesn't really rely on one physical space, but that is nomadic and has an online platform. And I think these models will allow, hopefully, for more galleries to enter the system.
Right.
So, yes.
Liza, do you see different generation artists, for example, reacting differently to this?
So I think certainly a lot of the younger galleries, I totally agree with Pedro and his observation, which is the really positive side of things. But I also am seeing that, which is very sad, is that so many younger galleries have actually closed as a result of this time, which is huge amounts of hard work and energy and lots of artists that are really, really suffering and really battling to kind of make ends meet. So that's been particularly, I think, devastating in terms of what we've been seeing.
To complement what
sorry, Pedro, you carry on.
Just to complement what Liza says, I feel that there is a certain lack of leadership in the system, especially emerging from the very big galleries, where I do feel there is a burden on the more privileged galleries to support the system and prevent those younger galleries to disappear. I have seen some of them have provided temporary platforms, and they have tried to reach out to a larger audience, but I have felt that mostly it wasn't quite genuine, and it was very much, based upon their immediate interests to expand their database and sort of data collecting.
I totally agree with Pedro. I think they could be doing so much more, for the whole arts ecology and the whole ecosystems globally. And I think that it would, I do agree with Pedro.
Yeah, it's predatory rather than collaborative to some extent. So question here, somebody says you've touched a little on the differences in terms of local as an urban or rural concept. Do you see changes in how those roles do you see changes in the urban versus the rural now? A greater thinking of that as opposed to just the system in terms of the concept of countryside as a increasing in its significance for the future of the art world? Or do you think that when there's a vaccine, it's just business as usual?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure like that, but yeah, I think so. I think it's generally the what appeals to people about art is something that's very individualistic, and that should have anything to do with whether it's local or global. It's going to have the same moment for them. So I'm hoping that it will we'll see some improvement in looking at artists from different places, but not really typifying them that way as being this, that, or the other, but just good art.
Right.
Good.
Yeah, I agree with Suzanne. And I feel that there's the detailization of the experience allows for more things to take place. Think about, for instance, Robert Smith's and The Great Jetty, when it was taking place, the audience was very small. there was a true desire to generate and to create something that was grand, that was major. But the question of the audience was lacking. And we only know about the Spalleggiati because of scholarship and because of art books and art history books. Now, if you think about if Robert Morris were today doing the Spalleggiati, we would be broadcasting that real time to the world, maybe through our Basel platform. And that could reach, everyone. So art history making and scholarship, I think, is now in tune with what's happening in Vietnam. Look at it analogically with the experience of migration. For instance, if you think of artists like Paulo Nazareth or Young Vo or William Kentridge, all of these artists are debating the metaphor of being in the outskirts of the world and yet doing something that pertains to us all. Talking about the human experience in the local level, but making that into the grand tragedy and comedy of being human. So I do think it is possible that we are entering a chapter where art history will be made in a different way. Also, the fact that the canon has radically shifted, and that's not coming back. This is for good. The canon now is one that looks into minorities, that looks into the original, that look into the native populations. The idea of primitivism is abolished as a concept that was paternalizing, and it was enormously engendered by the white male supremacy to basically curb the production that was regional and local. So I think we're going to see a completely different art production from now on that is very much based upon regional relevance and versus the canonized Western single narrative. Of art.
People are essentially taking more power and changing the system from where you stand. Well, thank you all so much. This has been really fascinating for me. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope our audience has. Thank you all for joining us, and to everybody who has commented and submitted questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. Just to let you all know that all of the OVR Miami Beach conversations will appear shortly on artbasel.com. If you've missed any of the previous two, please feel free to go take a look. And that's all from us. So thank you very much to Pedro, to Liza, and to Suzanne, and to everybody who's listened. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.